Good afternoon. Hello, everybody, to another episode of Tibet Talks. We have a very special guest with us today, a very familiar for all of us in the Tibet movement, Mr. John Ackerly, who was president of ICT for many years. John is here to today talk about a look back at the 1987 Tibet Uprising and its legacy today. But before we begin, our team here at ICT, since most of our audience knows John so well, but maybe we thought we know from him from his work here at ICT, but we want to know some little bit more about who John is. So we have some questions for you here, the team prepared. So who is John Ackerly, and so the first question is, who is John Ackerly?
Oh, okay. So just so everyone knows, I have not heard these questions before. So, well, in context of this, John Ackerly definitely has some adventurous spirit, especially with my friend Blake, who I went to Tibet with. We had quite a few adventures in college. And so, and I like to think that continues in my life, maybe a little less so than when I was in my 30s. But
is John Ackerly a climber?
Yes. So, and that's again with in college, climbing was my favorite, non-academic activity. And my friend Blake and I went to Yosemite. We climbed Half Dome and El Cap, and that's one of the reasons we went to Tibet is to get to the Himalayas and do some high altitude trekking. We didn't bring climbing gear, but we got to the highest point in the world that you can get to in sneakers, which is 21,000 feet.
And one of the most scariest things that I've done is climb up in Wyoming, the Grand Teton with you, which I had no idea what to expect. So what are John's top 3 climbs in his life?
Oh, I'd have to say, Yosemite, Half Dome was a top one. I got to go mountaineering once in Peru, in the Cordillera Blanca, so Alpamayo is the top one. And yeah, I think the other top one would be the Grand Teton because of David Brashears, Jimmy Chin, and Conrad Anker, who were all donating their time, and it was so exciting to be around them, and equally exciting to bring people like you who didn't know what you were getting into.
That's right. You always had a Tibetan on the climb with you all. I know Ngahong Sandrala, who's a former political prisoner. Lighter question. What is John Ackerly's favorite Tibetan dish?
Oh, well, it's the predictable one, momos. And I have to say, one of the best momos, I had both the best and the worst momos in Tibet. I had amazing vegetarian momos in Tibet, just up in some teeny village. And I also had plenty of momos that were just filled with little gristle.
With natural herbs, probably.
Yeah.
What does John Ackerly do in his free time?
Well, one of the main things I do, I'm a drummer. And so I drum in several rock and roll bands here in Tacoma Park, Maryland. That's my main thing. And then I still go rock climbing with my son. And my son and I play a lot of ping pong.
John, so now we want to ask you for the talk today, how you started your Tibet advocacy and your work with ICT, all of that. Where did it all begin?
Sure. So it began in college. My best friend Blake Kerr always said he wanted to go to Tibet. And so in 1987, we both had a kind of a gap in our career. I'd finished law school, he was in med school. And he had read The Third Eye in high school, which, is a very kind of discredited book, but sparked his imagination. And so it really was a personal trip. We were both mountaineers, so we wanted to see the Himalayas and get up, do some trekking. But we really didn't know anything about Tibet. We had read that when you go to Tibet, you should bring Dalai Lama postcards. And so we went to the Office of Tibet the day before we flew out to get, a big stack of Dalai Lama postcards. They're kind of like, baseball cards in Tibet. They're really valued. I mean, I shouldn't say it's much more important than baseball cards, but it's really something you collect and keep. And while we were there, they gave us a sheaf of papers. It had a New York Times article, a few other articles, and it had a copy of a resolution that the Congress had just passed earlier in 1987, detailing all the atrocities that had happened. We had no idea the Congress had done anything. So anyway, we threw this in our backpack and we took off. Spent a month in China, and we got here to the Jinjiang Hotel in Chengdu. And at that time, I finally read the resolution. And I said, "Oh my God!" And I realized that this hotel, back then in China, there's no such thing as self-service coffee machines. So it was really one of the first kind of high-risky things we did was sneak behind a desk and copy 25 copies of that resolution.
But you and they both didn't speak Chinese, right?
No, we didn't speak any Chinese. I mean, I spoke pidgin Chinese. I took a little Chinese course, but very basic. So threw it in our backpack, and we took the train around to Golmud. And we took a bus up to Lhasa. Back then, it was a 2-day bus ride, and it was kind of like in the South in the 1960s. The Tibetans were all in the back of the bus, and the Chinese were in the front. The Tibetans were smoking and just laughing and carrying on, and the Chinese, a few of them were throwing up, and it was kind of the first real lesson about the impact of altitude on the Chinese. And the other thing that was I really noticed is how Tibetans still seem very traditional in their dress, whereas in China there's a lot of them are still in Mao suits. Otherwise, they were very westernized. And so it really struck me that when we got to Tibet, it really appeared to me like Tibetans were still investing in their own culture and really identifying as Tibetans.
I was talking to a Tibetan from Lhasa just the other day, and he was telling me how Tibetans were all in Mao suits in 79, 80, but it was the delegation from Dharamsala that Tibetans, that the first 3 delegations after Tencho being opened up, and His Holiness was able to send the delegations into this the fact-finding delegations. They went all in Tibetan clothes.
Interesting.
And when they got there, this friend of mine was telling me how they kind of woke up from this space that they were existing in at that time. Because
when was the last delegation?
That delegation, I think the first went in 78, 79, 80, and then they stopped them, right? And that delegation, when they went, that was the first time, because Tibet had remained closed completely until then. So that was the first time they saw Tibetans, that the Dalai Lama was alive and healthy, and there was a government in exile, that there were schools, there were monasteries. So I think it was eye-opening.
Interesting. Yeah. So I mean, to me, I don't think at the time I appreciated the Cultural Revolution that was so recent. So anyway, as you can see on this slide, this shows Chinese settlements really didn't exist above 10,000 feet historically, and for good reason. Apparently, the Chinese are more susceptible. So to me, this is the resilience of Tibet has so much to do with its altitude, which will not change. So we get to Lhasa, and I love this photo. Someone took this photo with the drone, but it shows how central the Jokang is in the landscape of Lhasa. It's right in the middle of town, and you can see the bar core is a circuit that goes around Jokang Temple. It's probably about half a mile in length, and on the bottom right of the picture, just outside the picture, is a police station. which we didn't know about. And right in front of that police station, you can see that's the longest open part of the Barkor circuit. It's right on that right-hand edge of the photo, and that's where the demonstrations happened, which we'll see in a minute. So, everyone struggles at first with the altitude. As like with all tourists, we started going to monasteries, and Sarah and Drepung, the two big monasteries very close to Lhasa, I think both were somewhat spared. They weren't totally destroyed. And we started meeting monks, and they started handing us notes, and immediately we're kind of drawn into this world where, communication was really, you had to be careful when you talk to Westerners. Well, they trusted us as Westerners, but they couldn't let anyone really see. But most of Tibet, they're just destroyed monasteries everywhere. And I think there still are. I think more have been rebuilt by now. But they look like they've been destroyed for 50 years, but they've really just been 10 to 20 years, maybe 30. I didn't realize, but it was just 1976 that the Cultural Revolution ended. That's when I graduated from high school. And I didn't realize at the time that anyone that was over 20 years old, including all the monks that were demonstrated, they had experienced the Cultural Revolution. And it was very raw at the time. So this began kind of politicizing us as we heard more and more, and we found a real demand. People really wanted to tell us and talk to us, and I think they were glad that some Americans were willing to listen. And then we met a Tibetan Canadian, Nima Sering, right? Nima Dorje. And he's the guy on the right with the blue jean jacket. And he had a Canadian passport, so he had some level of protection. And he started coming around with us and translating. So at that point, a whole world of knowledge opened. And we could ask anything we wanted, and they could tell us anything they wanted to tell us. And so, the stories were heartbreaking. I mean, just really sadistic torture, long prison sentences. Every single family, I think, was really touched and scarred. And so we were getting more and more sucked in. At that point, we realized we had these resolutions. So we gave a resolution to the monk who we were interviewing us, and we gave one to one monk in Sarah and one in Drepung. Later we found out that they made wood blocks and reproduced part of them, and I guess those circulated around Lhasa. And we had no idea, but at the time the Dalai Lama was coming to Washington. I think he arrived middle of September. And we wouldn't have known either, except for we heard around in Lhasa because the Chinese propaganda machine went into high gear and they were denouncing him. But as they denounced him, they also informed everybody that he was here. So that really got, I think, hopes up, hearing that he was being received officially in the U.S. Congress. And so, and then I think also in the recent memory, if you can go back a couple, in recent memory, so there's one of the last delegations in the bottom right, meeting with the Panchen Lama.
That was the first delegation.
The first delegation,
yes.
Okay. So the Panchen Lama was still alive.
Yes.
And he was a fierce advocate.
Yes.
Unbeknownst to, I think, a lot of people, they didn't realize how, that he had become a real advocate. And also Hu Yaobang was still alive. And anyone that's familiar with, Chinese Tibetan history, Hu Yaobang was also, there's no leader of his rank that had been more outspoken on Tibet. And I think that gave people hope too, because they thought things, could change in Beijing. Okay, next. So we handed out these posters. This is a post office. We posted a couple on the door, and we saw the next day we came and we saw them trying to get fingerprints, and so they were definitely looking for us. And then, news came that the Dalai Lama was here, and he came to deliver the 5-point peace plan. which is a historic moment. And he was invited by Congressman Rose, Lantos, and Porter, who are all up there. You can see Lodi. That was when Lodi started becoming much more active in Washington. Tenzin Geshe to his left.
Yes.
And there you'll see, the propaganda machine was in full swing, denouncing him. And I think, but still, as tourists, we were kind of oblivious to what was happening. We had no idea anything could or would ever happen. But on September 27th, the first demonstration happened, and these were monks from Drepung who came. They marched a couple miles into town and were beaten up, arrested in front of this Tibetan crowd, which happened right after this picture was taken. I don't know who got this picture, not me. And then, about that time, we started, some foreigners started talking about, gathering information and trying to get names of prisoners. Robbie Barnett was there at the time, also just as a tourist. The guy here on the right is Steve Lehman, a professional photographer who was just there on vacation. The guy in the middle, whose head is bent down, is not looking at a phone, believe it or not, because none of us had phones back then. That was Nick Howen, and I think he was a volunteer for Amnesty International. Anyway, this became kind of the class of '87. But the night of this September 27th, right after this picture was taken, we were arrested. And we had been staying at this hotel in Lhasa, the Banak Shoal Hotel, and they came into our room, they took everything they could find, books and so forth. And we spent 2 days being interrogated, and they did not mistreat us, but it was really startling to me that they focused mostly on what we thought. They wanted to know if we believed in the Dalai Lama, if we believed in Tibetan independence. Of course, they wanted to know names of anyone we had talked to. That was easy. We didn't even barely know names. We never wrote anyone's name down that we talked to. But it was clear that if we were compliant, they were going to be easier on us. But if we stuck up for our beliefs, it would mean they'd be a lot tougher. I wanted my passport back, and I was scared that we could be facing something serious. Blake, who's much more impulsive, we just spent weeks listening to these stories, and so you can imagine at that point, here we had some Chinese guy who knew nothing about Tibet lecturing us. And it really pissed Blake off. So he was arguing with them. I was kicking him under the table. But we did get our passports back, and we had a week to get out of the country. They canceled our passport. They canceled our visa. So the very next morning, we wake up, and Lhasa had erupted because monks from Sera Monastery came down into town, dozens of them, and they made it once around the Barkor. We weren't there yet. We got here right at this moment when they'd already been arrested. Again, they were beaten up in front of a Tibetan crowd, and then word spread like wildfire. And Tibetans turned over these police vehicles, set them on fire, and thousands of Tibetans came down to the Barkor. It was, there was almost a sense of euphoria in the morning because the police were driven out of the Barkor, and it kind of felt like Tibetans took control of the city in a way, or at least the Barkor. And, I think the Chinese didn't know what to do. You can see a massive crowd. And, Tibetans were throwing plenty of rocks. You can't say it was totally nonviolent at all, but they didn't use lethal force. In fact, once a Chinese soldier dropped a gun, and a Tibetan picked it up and broke it. Yeah,
but they were being fired.
But they were being fired at.
Yes.
So at about noon, we heard some pops, and then we realized they were shooting into the crowd. I heard one bullet go right by my head, and I didn't quite realize for a second what it was yet. But probably about a dozen Tibetans were killed, but a lot of Tibetans got leg wounds because they were shooting low. They weren't always shooting to kill. And then there's a huge debate, a little bit at the time, whether foreigners should participate, because a lot of Tibetans ran up, gave me rocks, and they wanted me to participate. And I didn't throw a rock, but a few foreigners did. And that was a huge debate in the days afterwards. Robbie Barnett was very vocal that kind of denouncing foreigners who did that, because they were obviously taking pictures. Both sides were taking pictures. This is a German guy, very brave, and also throwing rocks. Anyway, so at one point, these two monks ran into the police station. The police station had been set on fire. A couple dozen monks were inside of it who had been detained. And I think they did succeed in freeing some of the monks. And other monks jumped up the side window and were captured, still in control. But this monk, Jampa Tenzin, I just happened to be there and got pictures of him. And you can see in the hands, people are holding rocks, but the feeling of power in that crowd was palpable. They were so.
This has been an iconic photo for the whole movement.
And I've always believed these photos belong to the Tibetan people who risked so much that day. And so I've always said anyone can use it however they want. And then he was put in a windowsill and given kata. And he was in shock, and he survived that day. And he actually was a monk from Jokang. He was not a Sera monk. And we can talk about him now because he's passed away. But everyone knew who he was. And he spent time in prison and then was released and was a monk again at the Jokang. So towards the end of the day, the police started shooting more, and eventually the crowd did disperse. And this is the following day. The Tibetans were going into the police station and taking all the files out, and everyone in the neighborhood had a file on themselves, so people were getting their own files, which was kind of empowering. And then, the next week, it was heartbreaking because thousands of people were being arrested. So every night and day, there were sirens going off through Lhasa and people being dragged off the streets. And the police were still after us, actually. They came back to our hotel room, and one of the hotel workers alerted us, and we were able to run out of the room and hide. And we slept in other rooms because we couldn't really go back to our room. They had a curfew, and these are, in the upper right, Tibetans are reading the curfew signs. In the lower left is a Tibetan who was executed. This was a few years later. This was not from 87, but there were executions, public executions, that happened a couple weeks after the demonstration in Lhasa. Okay. So, and a few reporters were let into the city, and a few consular officials. Dan Sutherland, I think a lot of Tibetans know, he worked at Radio Free Asia for a long time. And there's a write-up about us. We had no clue that we were in the New York Times. Here it says, American tourists are still in Chinese custody. That was October 4th. We were released September 30th. But
how did the photographs get out?
Oh, when we took pictures during the demonstration, we would give it to a runner, because we knew whatever tourists were detained, got caught by the Chinese, the first thing they do is break their camera, open it, and take the film. So we carefully, we had, people would run the film back to the hotel. And back then it was all, slide film. So we also we didn't have that much film, so we couldn't even take that many pictures. And then ultimately I was able to, I just put it in a bunch of dirty clothes in a backpack, and we flew out. We kind of pretended to be with this fancier tour group that they decided not to search so much, so we were able to get our film out. So yeah, and when we came out, our dream, Blake and I were saying, oh my God, wouldn't it be amazing to see the Dalai Lama? We thought it would probably be very difficult, but then we heard that he wanted to see us because we didn't know that we'd been in the press. And so we gave a press conference in Delhi. You can see here, someone actually just sent me this photo. I only saw this photo in the upper right for the first time. And one of the most impactful things I think we did since then was we gave a talk at TCF, which your mother ran. I think she invited us. And so many Tibetans have come up to me since then and told me that they were at that talk, and that hearing kind of what they already knew, but hearing it from Westerners was very validating. And I think a lot of what we did was not necessarily to tell anyone that knew, but the fact that it came from a Westerner made it more believable. And when we had bullet casings from the demonstrations, and we gave one to the Dalai Lama, he kind of chuckled. He says, "Usually people give me flowers. You give me bullets."
That was those photographs that you all took over there and brought out. I think for Tibetans outside and the whole movement, it was resurgence of energy and support and connection, because it was the first time that Tibet was on the mainstream media like that.
That's
and
right.
Your photographs were everywhere, and then that Ghana, galvanized this whole protests and actions everywhere. So I think it was really important.
Yeah. Now it's almost 40 years now. So I gave this similar talk to some young Tibetans a couple months ago, and I was kind of surprised that how new it was to them. Some of them didn't know. Of course, you don't know the granular details of some of this, but it was very. That's one reason I'm here now, is I wanted to come and do it again. I think, now I'm fast forward to a different part of my talk and something that makes me hopeful, and I think should make us all hopeful, is that, and it really reflects what I saw when I was there, when you get into remote parts of Tibet and there are no Chinese. Cities, of course, there are Chinese. But, today China's population is declining, just like Japan and Korea. And in these slides, you can see, the birth rates are going, and they predict that China's population could go down well under 1 billion, maybe, 700 million by 2100. I think India will be higher. Even Nigeria might be more populated. But the impact this has on Tibet, we shouldn't underestimate. And, I spent so many years talking about the Chinese population transfer. And despite all these decades of Chinese influx, I think what we underappreciate is how many Chinese are also leaving. And so in this slide, you can see, this is an official census, which a lot of even Tibetan scholars think is pretty somewhat reliable. It does not include military. So it's not, but it does include full-time residents. So there's an influx in the summer. But you can see here, the TAR is still almost 90% Tibetan. And that is very significant. Now, the Chinese population, even from 210 to 220 really went up. It went up almost 200,000 people, which is, a tiny drop in the ocean for, Chinese numbers. But look at the Tibetan population went up 400,000.
Yeah.
And so this is, I know there are a lot of numbers here, but it's really, if you look at the age of children, that 0 to 14, what we're seeing here, and this is confirmed in quite a few other statistics and journals, is that there are a lot of young Tibetans. The birth rates of Tibetans are quite high, which is pretty significant. And the Gyatso, 95% Tibetan. In the winter, in the summer, like I say, there's temporary people and tourists and so forth. But I think the hopeful message is that in some ways there is time on the cultural front. Now, this does not reflect any political realities. You know, the higher positions are still all dominated by Chinese. But, you know, I think what it shows is that the Chinese, they don't want to retire in Tibet. They don't want to give birth in Tibet, so that the birth certificate is from a province, and that allows that person to go back and get their benefits later in life in that province, which is really important.
And genetically, Tibetans have this ability to live on the plateau, which the Chinese are worried about giving birth in the plateau, living too long on the plateau, because they don't know what altitude will do.
That's right. And there are higher mortality rates during birth for Chinese. And here you can see, you know, this is showing a population decrease very recently in Tibet, which is, you know, pretty significant, something I hadn't, so even though there's the birth rate, the natural increase is going up, there's a population decrease, which means Chinese are leaving. You can scroll down to the bottom of this slide.
This is from a Chinese source.
Yeah. So here it says, the province, it has, you know, percentage-wise, it's been going up, but the overall population suggesting a high rate of emigration. So this is, you know, I think pretty significant. Next slide. So this train goes both ways. You know, it makes it easier for people to come in. It makes it easier for people to go out. I also showed this picture to younger Tibetans to identify this city. This is Gyatso. It's the second largest city in Tibet. The prefecture has 800,000 people, but they're mostly in this city. 12,600 feet. You know, that's a place. It's higher than Lhasa. And so you think all the jobs in this town, you know, local government are all Tibetan. And, you know, I think His Holiness has also said, as have, you know, some other leaders of movements, that people need to stay and learn how to run the country. And also, you know, the Dalai Lama has also said, if you're questioned, don't stand up for me. Do what's best. You know, you're more useful in your own society doing what you can rather than be in prison. So, you know, he's been pretty clear about that. Next slide.
And he's also said the future.
That's right. And he said
yes,
the future government of Tibet should be run by Tibetans from Tibet. He's not saying, you know, it's not for the government in exile to go back. That's also, it's an important message for inside Tibet that, you know, because the Chinese like to say that there's a ruling class that wants to come back and reestablish their rule. He said, that the government should be totally secular. The Dalai Lama himself, the monastery should have no role in government. So that's very
pragmatic vision.
Very pragmatic.
Right from the beginning.
So this is Chamdo Prefecture. It's the third largest city in Tibet. 10,800 feet and 94% Tibetan. So, so that's what I wanted to leave with. And this is, you know, it's really the cultural survival, I think, is really, there's, you know, a lot of Tibetans are doing a lot of things in a lot of different sectors, in film and literature and art, and there is a vibrancy at the local level. Of course, it all has to be very carefully run so it doesn't step afoul of any political. And there are huge threats, you know, Tibetans being taken to China for education, you know, all sorts of things are going on. So I don't mean to paint a rosy picture whatsoever, but I do think we do need to recognize some of the positive things that are helping the struggle of Tibetans that are going on today and that, you know, have been going on since I was there in '87. It was for people that that go there today, if you get beyond your tourist itinerary, you can still see this yourself.
The resiliency and the spirit of the Tibetan people. John, for somebody, you've been now unknowingly plucked and put into the Tibet freedom struggle and movement, and as a tourist dropped into the midst of everything, and you've been involved leading this organization for so long. You stepped back from leadership to start your own organization and do other things, but you've always stayed engaged, and now again you've been there even as I took on as president. For every phone call, everything that I need, you're always there as a sounding board and helping us and guiding us. So don't you get tired of us with it?
No, I think, so after 87, I went back. I was able to go back 4 times before my visa was impossible. So it really got under my skin, just the, I don't think I could ever have developed that kind of bond with the issue in exile. But it's really that time in Tibet, and hearing, just so many joyful voices, so many defiant voices, seeing people and feeling the, that spirit. It's feeling, that it's a really vibrant, there's some vibrancy in the culture, which I think is so important to, to me, to think that, what we do is still important. And I think the movement in the West is still really important because, the Tibetans have been told so long that they're a backward people and a backward culture. And I think all the interest in Buddhism and in Tibetan culture, that totally seeps across borders. I think I feel the movement in exile has been so important message-wise for people inside Tibet, even though, they can't, they only hear a teeny bit, but and of course it's the friends, making friends with such wonderful people, one of the last things I did as president was hire you, and you've worked really hard and rose up, and you're now president. So seeing, seeing these changes and seeing younger people take the lead.
I'm not so young.
Younger than me. No, it's been wonderful. So I'll never. I needed to leave ICT because I realized I needed to change, and I'd kind of given everything I could give, and I didn't want to outlast my welcome. When I said I wanted to leave, Lodi tried to convince me to stay. Most of the board tried to convince me to stay. There's one board member who said, "John, good move." And I appreciate his honesty. There's Joel McCleary. I appreciated Joel for that.
No, I was at an event earlier today listening to Speaker Emerita Pelosi talking about her book, and one of the questions and one of the areas she talked about was also when leadership also means that you leave with the organization so that it can be moving to a higher place. So I think, your message is that, and that is the goal for me as well, to make sure that this organization will have the success, the future success. And I think with younger Tibetans that born and brought up in exile also, I see so many who want to be part of this movement and who want to be connected, to find their roots and still feel that connection. And I think that's really important. And the Dalai Lama's message has resonated with our generation, but it's so vibrant and perfect for today's young people as well. So I think one of the goals, activities that we're also doing, John, is in 2025, as His Holiness turns 90, how do we share his message to a wider audience, and how do we get people engaged on learning about this to benefit themselves, but also to carry the torch and carry the message of the Tibetans inside Tibet.
I always remember that His Holiness would always ask Jewish leaders, how do you do it? How do you keep your culture alive through so many, atrocities and being dispersed all over the world? But now I think people should look at Tibet and say, hey, how do you guys do it? How have you done it? Because, there's a large exile population which stays connected, but still, the majority, 90% of Tibetans are in Tibet. And how they're doing that is a real, I think, lesson for cultural perseverance.
We have a question for you. So
we have one question from the audience. Could you tell the story about you and ICT in general attending the UN Women's Conference in Beijing?
Okay, so that was a real highlight. We really, the UN meetings are always an opportunity to kind of inject ourselves in this, especially. So we were able to provide funding for 2 or 3 people, including Yoden Tanden. You may remember more Jimmy. I think Jimmy was also there. Jimmy Tanden. 2 or 3 others. We also sent a man, Reed Brody, who was at Human Rights Watch, and together they orchestrated one of the most brilliant moments in photo ops where the Tibetans they put scarves around their mouths to show that they're being gagged, and it was actually pretty dicey because Chinese authorities were around and they kind of inserted themselves. It was raining out apparently, and they kind of really had to push themselves out there and get in front of the media. But when that photo was taken, it's also one of the iconic photos of the Tibet movement. And it was, scary for all these, Tibetan women in Beijing. I think most of them had Western passports, but still, it's intimidating. So, so that was a real highlight.
What were the consequences that they faced? Because I know that, there was that iconic photo of them all holding hands.
Yeah.
They had their mouths covered.
Yeah.
What happened after?
I don't think there are any serious consequences. Okay. I think they all, some of them were questioned, but they all, left their flights.
To go off on that, just these iconic photos that have been circulating in the movement for the past years. For me as a Tibetan American and as a daughter of Tibetan refugees, and someone that is pretty involved in my own Tibetan community back home in New York, whether it's with protests or just going to the Tibetan Community Center, I've seen these photos around a lot and not known the story behind these photos, especially the one of the Tibetan monk Champala, who had his fist up in the air. So thank you for sharing the stories. I think more people need to know the background behind the photos or the context. But one question I have, especially since you had firsthand experience in Tibet witnessing these protests, were how do you think those protests in 1987 kind of changed the course of Tibetan history?
Okay. Yes, I guess one thing I didn't mention is that there was a huge wave of repression after that. So you could say Tibetans paid a real price for those protests, and hundreds and hundreds of people. Some people got 20-year jail sentences, sentenced to death. The torture that went on, but it did galvanize the movement both inside Tibet and outside. And in Tibet, there's been huge demonstrations since then. 1988 is as late as 2008. So we know that the spirit inside is strong. And then, of course, there were the self-immolations, which are just tragic to see. But and that also showed just how different people in all different parts of society, different ages, men, women, monks, nuns. I should mention the nuns, especially nuns. We talked a lot about monks today, but nuns have also been a real backbone of resistance. But yeah, it really helped. It came at a time, when the Dalai Lama was traveling a lot, and when he was, I think, being accepted on the international stage more, and it validated his message. And then 2 years later, he got the Nobel Peace Prize, which came right after, Tiananmen Square. And the way what happened in Lhasa that day was kind of like a mini Tiananmen Square unfolding, very quickly compared to Beijing. But I think at that point, the whole world really realized that, what China was willing to do to its own people. And to this day, that's the narrative. People now still know that China has not changed too much, and so we're still hopeful that someday it will. We know there's millions of Chinese out there who also want it to happen, and you like to think that dictatorships can't last forever. That democracies are more stable. What His Holiness has created is much more stable than exile. So I hope I hope I'm still alive.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.